Yeah, so we had an interesting kind of side conversation going about Scrum, and you had some pretty strong opinions on Scrum. So I'd be kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are, because I have my own thoughts around it, because I've done it to a degree, um, varying degrees of success. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts for, before we dive into mine.
Yeah, so I suppose my first agile project was before my first waterfall project because the very first thing I worked on um, was where we worked with the customer. We went and sat in their space and found out what they did, and we created software, and then they all smiled and found delight in using it. And then got moved because of that project. I got moved into a proper software team because
Mm,
that was before I was a proper developer. And then I did waterfall for ages, and then I was at my first organization where they started talking about agile, and they were talking about Scrum, and we got put on the Scrum training courses and all of that stuff. And I kind of liked the sound of it because it sounded like what I did on my first proper
hmm.
project before I became a software developer, even though I wrote all of the code for that project. It was like, oh, so we actually get to speak to the customers, right? So I really liked the manifesto, and I thought Scrum was how you implemented the manifesto. So I kind of embraced it in those early days. And then as I moved around a few organizations and they were all doing Scrum, I just found it was impossible to move away from those common problems. The planning meetings where someone's thing isn't getting into that
Hmm.
sprint and they're not happy and they're like, can't you just add it in and let's call it a bonus feature and all of these weird things people do around the edges because they don't want to have the difficult conversations. Um, and it also just doesn't talk to any of the technical capabilities that you need.
Yeah.
So I found extreme programming after I found Scrum and subsequently couldn't believe that that's not what we were doing. That's kind of the point at which I became disillusioned with it. And I was on a team. We were doing Scrum and it wasn't working for all the usual reasons because it is just, the cadence is supposed to come from these ceremonies, but the ceremonies just all turn into these husks of,
Hmm.
we should be having a conversation at this point, so we'll just stand up and have a conversation in the morning. And this is supposed to be a demo, but it's not really a demo because we couldn't get the people here that should be here. And so it's supposed to be planning, but actually it's just people telling us that that thing's not allowed to be an eight, it has to be a three because otherwise it won't fit. So all of that dysfunction was in it. So we just went into a room as one small team in this organization and said, is there anything we would keep? And what should we do instead? And we created a process that was kind of based around extreme programming. It used specification by example at
Hmm.
the top to find out what was needed. We automated those before we started work, and then we worked until all of those business specifications went green. And then we released that version. And we over the course of a few months we got down to doing 3 hour cycles. And so
Mm.
our product owner, who was a clinically trained nurse, would be like working out what to look at next, so that 3 hours later we would go and have another conversation and generate the specs and go around again. But we were doing all of the stuff that Ken Beck said we should do, which is mostly technical practices with a little bit of how you manage the work around the edges, whereas Scrum is
Mm.
completely empty of technical practices, and I just don't think that's viable. So yeah, that's the long story of how I got disillusioned with Scrum.